Welcome to today's Ocean Connector, an opportunity for the ocean community to come together, share, learn, and make new connections. My name is Melanie Nadeau, and I'm the CEO of COVE, the Center for Ocean Ventures and Entrepreneurship. And I'm really excited to be the host today for our Ocean Connector. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our Ocean Connector sponsors, Cox & Palmer, Killam Properties, and our founding industrial partner, Irving Shipbuilding. Last month, you may recall that we held COVE Demo Day, and our last Ocean Connector was a recap of that demo day. So I'd encourage you to check it out on our YouTube channel, become a subscriber, and like the videos. It's a great recap of all the amazing technologies that are here at COVE. Also in June, we announced a really exciting project called Sumquanesque, a partnership led by Lohnes and in partnership with COVE and Upswing Solutions to have Indigenous-led businesses in the ocean sector. So more to come on that project, and I look forward to sharing information as time goes on. Today, we have 4 guests that are joining us today on our Ocean Connector. First, we have Elisa Obermann, who's the Executive Director of Marine Renewables Canada, the National Industry Association for Offshore Renewable Energy. Next, we've got Erin Donahue, a Canadian Trade Commissioner located at the Consulate General in Boston. Erin leads efforts for the defense, ocean tech sector, and aerospace sector. Then we've got Robin Lohnes, CEO of Dominion Diving. Dominion is just a stone's throw away from COVE. Robin runs a successful family business that is one of the largest providers of diving and marine services in Canada. And lastly, we've got James Ives, the founder and CEO of Ocean, headquartered in Ireland, and has many years of experience in the offshore energy business. Welcome to all of you. Our topic for today is talking about the future of offshore wind. In 2020, the installed capacity of offshore wind was just over 35 gigawatts, and it's expected to double in the next couple of years. At COVE, offshore wind has been an important sector for us. And we know that there are many commercialization opportunities in this sector that can drive down costs, improve technology, and improve operations also offshore, as well as build the proper talent pool to service this industry. We also know that offshore wind is part of the world's path to getting to net zero. So with that intro, I'd like to kick it off with Elisa. Elisa, for a lot of the ocean community that COVE is involved with, there's a big interest in what's happening, of course, in Canada, also along the eastern seaboard, moving into the US, and across the Atlantic over to Europe. Can you give us a sense of the landscape and what's happening in the offshore wind sector in all of those regions? And just give us your insights, given that you've been involved in the sector for several years.
All right, so first of all, Melanie and COVE, thanks very much for having me here today. I'm very happy to be talking about this topic. And as you had alluded to, there is a lot of activity in the offshore wind industry globally. And the 3 markets that you mentioned, I'd say we see the most activity in Europe. That's the most mature market. 90%, I think, of installed global capacity is just in the North Sea alone. And so that obviously creates some opportunities for companies, but for Canadian companies, but there's obviously a lot of supply chain already engaged there. The U.S. that you mentioned is, I would call it or characterize it kind of as the hottest emerging market. There's a lot of attention to things that are happening there. I think now there's about 16 to 17 active commercial leases, maybe a bit more. And anybody following the media too would see that the Biden administration is really pushing for accelerated development of offshore wind there. So that creates a lot of opportunities for offshore wind supply chain and for Canadian companies, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that more. And then lastly, getting to Canada, people would obviously recognize we don't have offshore wind development here yet, but that's not to say that there isn't a lot of activity already to kind of develop a foundation for that. So the federal government has done quite a bit in laying the groundwork through the Canadian Energy Regulator Act to develop a framework for offshore wind. Through that, they've been working on regulations. There's been a number of studies, both done by Nova Scotia and Newfoundland to just understand feasibility, but also some of the supports that could be put in place. And one of the things I would also mention is that the federal government has also been working on its blue economy strategy. And I'm fairly optimistic that will also, really help to support offshore wind in the future. So all in all, I think, no matter what region of the world it is, there's opportunity and a lot of activity so far happening in offshore wind.
Thanks, Elisa. I know we've also participated here at Cove in the National Blue Economy Strategy, as you have, and many others that are on this Ocean Connector or that are listening in today. You characterize the U.S. as a hotbed of offshore or emerging market of offshore wind, and Erin sits in that hotbed. So Erin, maybe you can shed some light on what you do within the offshore wind sector in Boston, and also what you do to help some of the companies and be part of the supply chain that's developing down there.
Absolutely, and thank you, Melanie and Cove, for having me here today. So I cover the ocean technologies sector for the Canadian Consulate in Boston, and I've done that for over a decade now. As long as I've been at the consulate, offshore wind has been on the horizon, but it's really only in the past few years that we have seen it become a real opportunity where companies actually are getting into this supply chain. So my role as a Canadian Trade Commissioner is really to help Canadian companies navigate this new and developing supply chain. Sometimes that can be helping them identify potential buyers. Oftentimes it's demystifying that new and developing supply chain and pointing them in the direction of who they should be talking to and what the right point of the supply chain is for a Canadian company to enter this new market. We also offer support for Canadian companies that might be looking to set up offices here in the US. I'm hearing more and more from Canadian companies that are getting some early traction and saying they really need to have a presence down here, and we can help them a little bit, guiding where to set up and access to resources as they do so. We also help Canadian companies identify partners. And certainly I know a lot of companies that are looking at this developing supply chain are really deciding, do they partner? Do they set up a joint venture? Do they open an office? Those are some of the things we can help them walk through, as well as point them to additional resources that can go in more depth about their business and what makes sense.
Thanks, Erin. And I think I've also seen some material from you that you also are quite engaged in the different procurement opportunities that exist and share that with the supply chain.
Absolutely. So that is another side of what I do really is just following the industry. It's a full-time job for me. I can only imagine being a company having to look after a variety of opportunities around the world. So what I really try to do is know upcoming procurements, opportunities, accelerators, anything that might be of interest to Canadian clients and get the word out, because I know there is so much information right now. It's hard to filter through all of this. So this is something I'm doing individually. I will also put a plug and say I'm working with Elisa and her team to share that information so they can get it out to their membership.
I've been involved in different aspects of offshore wind probably for over 15 years. So I agree with you that the timing is right, and it's really exciting that there's so much development that's happening south of our border, and that so many companies are looking at offshore wind as a huge sector to meet all their renewable energy mandates. So Robin, as far as I know, you've been successful in tapping into the supply chain along the eastern seaboard. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about what your experience there has been, also the type of services that you provide for the offshore wind market, and how did you get that early entry into that market?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. We were contacted by a Belgian wind turbine installation company. It was based on our geographic location. Because of the Jones Act and how it works, a foreign vessel, I'm not fluent in the whole act and how it's written, but it restricts foreign vessels from mobilizing equipment out of the U.S., despite the fact that they're working off the coast of the U.S. or something like that. They had made the decision to mobilize all the equipment. They shipped it over to Nova Scotia, which was the closest service port, and all the components that had to be installed. And then while they were here, they made contact, or while they had decided to mobilize out of here, they made contact with us, and we had the exact equipment, subsea equipment available that they needed. So it really came together quite quickly, and it was a good match, because we've been involved in the offshore oil and gas off Nova Scotia and Newfoundland since the 1970s. The equipment that we have, subsea robotics, we refer to them as ROVs. They've got varying capabilities, different depth capacities, payload capacities. They got manipulators and cameras and things like that, measuring devices. They needed those services to install these components. They have several components that go together to form the column that comes up that the wind turbine sits on. And then after it's installed, there's inspection work and an anti-corrosion anode cages that had to be installed. So it was a real good match based on our location, our capability, and everything. So it really, I don't want to say it came together on its own, but it really fell on our doorstep. And we had just completed a 15-year contract with ExxonMobil. So the exact subsea equipment that we were using off of Nova Scotia in the Sable gas field was exactly what the company needed to monitor the installation of these wind turbines. It was very nice.
So I remember seeing those the wind turbines, the towers on the barge here in Halifax, and that was really neat to see. And I know that Elisa has been doing a lot of work with the group here around Nova Scotia to identify how we can be a landing point for some of those European wind developers as they go into the US market, because as you pointed out, the Jones Act is a challenge for some of those developers. So Elisa, I wonder if you could shed a bit of light on some of the work that you've been doing there, and what are your views on how more participation from this market can happen south of the border?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've been working a lot collaboratively with different organizations. One, just to promote and profile what the opportunity is. One of the challenges is although it's an opportunity, there also are a lot of local content laws and things like that. And so I think some developers are, a bit hesitant to start pursuing these international opportunities, but it's more so a necessity. So it gives us, obviously a very good marketing point there. So we've been doing things like trade missions, working with Erin, the Trade Commissioner Service. We've been working with a lot of local organizations. The other thing that has also happened is the Offshore Energy Research Association, OERA, worked with the province to commission some studies on using Sheet Harbor and just understanding more about, what kinds of upgrades and things might be helpful to attract European wind developers here. I think the key thing in all of this is that it really is a window of opportunity to use local infrastructure in our ports here, as well as suppliers, because what we are also seeing is the U.S. starting to invest in their ports, and also local vessels and vessels that can be used there. But it's still a great opportunity to get a foot in the door. And I think if we ever see offshore wind in Canada, it obviously gives us that leg up that there's some experience built here too.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So James, I want to move on to you, because today you're based in Ireland, but your business spans the globe. In fact, you've been working in Canada. I believe you've been working in the US in the offshore wind market, and in Europe. And maybe you can shed some light from a global point of view on what you're seeing are the differences between those different markets in the offshore wind space. And also, don't forget to mention what Xocean does in the offshore wind, because this is a fairly new company and you've been able to do quite well in the market.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Melanie. So I guess maybe starting with the services part. So Xocean is ultimately an ocean data company. The product we deliver to our clients is data. So that's everything from mapping the seabed to surveying assets that are on the seabed, such as foundations and cables. However, we do acquire that data with a difference. So rather than using a conventional vessel with a crew on board, we've developed kind of marine robotic technology, so uncrewed technology to collect this data. And I guess the key benefits there is, first of all, safety. Nobody needs to go offshore. Secondly, would be carbon emissions. We've about a thousandth of the emissions of a conventional vessel. And ultimately, we can deliver the data at a lower cost. And interestingly, if we look at the main clients that we have, they would span the oil and gas industry, so companies such as BP and Shell, agencies such as the hydrographic offices, but really fastest growing of all is that offshore wind sector, where we've delivered data to date to almost all of the major developers. And I guess looking at the question around what's the differences between the different markets we operate in, I think probably the biggest difference is the rate of adoption that we're seeing. As was mentioned earlier, the UK is very far ahead in terms of its development, around about 10 gigawatts of offshore capacity already installed and growing at a very, very rapid rate, where the other markets are only really getting started. And if we look at the life cycle of an offshore wind farm, really it's a 30-year project. You start with the development phase where you're investigating the site and the cable routes. You then move on to construction. And then finally, you're into, say, 25 years of operation of the wind farm. So I think what we're seeing is in the earlier stage markets, there's more focus on those development phases and construction phases, whereas in more mature markets like the UK, it's a lot more about the routine surveys, annual surveys of foundations, cables, export cables, and so on. So yeah, we're seeing a difference in the different markets that we're operating in.
So I expect then, James, that you're probably, given that you're closer to the UK market, you're involved in the operational side, also on the construction side with Xocean, and then the early stage feasibility development and whatnot that's required for some of these big farms.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Melanie. And interestingly, as you say, we're certainly finding that we're going around the world with this industry. So just recently, we started operations in Taiwan, where there's an enormous amount of development ongoing in offshore wind. So at the moment, it's predominantly in the construction phases. But yeah, the world is growing very, very fast in this market. 8 to 10 times over the next decade is the predicted growth. It's an amazing market to be involved in.
Thanks, James. So at Cove, we're very focused on the commercialization of technology, which means that innovation has to be at the forefront. And I've known James for a long time, and I know that he's an innovative guy, and his company is innovative as well. And Robin has been successful in part to their ability to innovate. So I'm curious to know from both of you, when you look at the whole slew of offshore wind, so from the early stage development side to construction to operations, and based on your businesses and what you know about operating in the offshore environment, what are some of those innovative ways or innovative technologies or whatnot that you see maybe coming in the next couple of years when you're looking at how this sector and how fast this sector is going to grow? So can either of you shed any light on that and your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that, Melanie. I mean, I think, when we look at the offshore wind sector, it's a relatively young industry, but it's growing at incredible pace. And as I said, growing 8 to 10 times in the next decade. And I think with that context, I think we find a sector that's very open to innovation and work and developing better ways to operate. What we're finding, I think, with the offshore wind developers is that, core to their values are around improving safety, reducing carbon and reducing cost. And the pull that we're certainly seeing in that sector is around remote operations, the ability to remove people from the field of action and to deliver whether it's data or monitoring or controls in a remote way. And certainly in our world, being able to develop an uncrewed system, we can address those. I think, a good example is that, trying to reduce cost in an offshore wind farm is a key target. If you're able to deliver the data at a lower cost, it means that you can collect more data more often, which means that you can do things, for example, monitoring exposure of cables more regularly. So you can actually get into preventative maintenance earlier rather than waiting for faults to develop. So, I think we're seeing a big push around developing remote solutions in offshore wind farms.
Yeah, that's probably a great handoff to Robin, because Robin has been crewing a lot of vessels, or his business has been crewing a lot of vessels. Safety is always number one priority. So what are your thoughts on the innovation lens for the offshore wind sector?
There's a shift right now in like when we operate our subsea vehicles, we're tethered from the vehicle to the ship. That's the mothership for that underwater vehicle to obtain information, various types of scanning and video inspection takes place. That was 90% of our work for ExxonMobil offshore Nova Scotia was inspection, repair and maintenance, but most of it being inspection. So the autonomous underwater vehicles are becoming a real thing that are becoming feasible to purchase and own, and the technology is becoming reliable. It's not yet something that we've employed in that specific manner, but it partially eliminates the need for a localized mothership. And it also has a greater because it's underwater and it's not being affected. It doesn't have a mothership that's being affected by the surface conditions. It has better continuity. Like if you're going to map a large area, it's going to take X amount of time. It's not so dependent on weather conditions. When you're operating a vessel or an ROV that has a mothership, you're limited to 3-meter seas and 25 knots of wind, which is not hard to arrive at in the North Atlantic. So that's likely a progression that you're going to see for mapping and all that. Now, all that being said, there's going to always be the need for physical intervention with anything that's installed in the ocean, vessels and personnel to arrive at the items and the installations and perform maintenance and repair work and things like that. So, and with wind farms, it's a very specific equipment for that. Again, you got to house the people. There's no accommodations on board on the installations themselves. So the vessel has to provide accommodations for the technicians. You have to have a method of transfer, safe method of transfer from the vessel to the installations in varying conditions. And there's several ways to do that. The vessels themselves have to have stability characteristics and shapes and hydrodynamics that optimize their stability when working, whether you're working off the vessel or, putting people on these installations and things like that. So we have several items in our toolbox that are not, the wind farm industry is fairly new. Other than our underwater vehicles, our traditional diving services, and things that we have now, we have a 2209 Euro carrier. It's a specialized type of vessel. I would describe it as like a mini aircraft carrier, which is not. It just has the wheelhouse off to one side, and it's got a large deck space and a crane and things like that. These are very commonly used to deploy cables, recover cables, like in Europe. The Euro carrier, another name for it is a multicat, which may be more familiar to some people. We have the only, or the first and the only multicat of its type in Canada. So we imported that in 2018. So we're in the process of building up our array of equipment that we have now to meet the specific requirements of the wind farm, wind turbine energy industry.
Thanks, Robin. And I know other companies as well are building up their capacities to be able to tap into that market. I wonder, Erin, if you could, given that you're so close to the market for companies here in Atlantic Canada, what are the short-term opportunities you see that these companies may be able to tap into? We heard that, the market in the US is really at the developmental stage. What do you foresee as being sort of those early wins that companies could tap into?
Sure, and I think you've already heard about some of them today. Those early opportunities at the development stage really, particularly for Canadian companies, are really coming at that survey data collection point right now. And we have a number of Canadian companies who are already quite active in this space. The one area I'll mention, because it's somewhat specific to the US offshore wind industry, is really the marine mammal monitoring piece. Where they're putting a lot of these wind farms is really right in the middle of where right whales habitats and where they navigate through the North Atlantic. So I know a number of developers in partnership with state and federal agencies are really looking at fully integrated solutions to be able to identify in real time where marine mammals are, so that when you reach the construction phase, you're able to shut down construction and not affect these already endangered species. And this is something that both politically and from a business standpoint is of particular interest to the US offshore wind market. But right now, it really, the activity and the opportunities are really well concentrated for the Cove community in the marine technology space. Survey, sensors, all of that work that's being done prior to construction is where you're going to be seeing the opportunities for the next few years, quite frankly, because there are developments that are lined up and down the East Coast.
Yeah, that's a really good point on the environmental assessments. There's a lot of folks working in that space, and of course, it's a big part of building any offshore major project, and then not only the assessment up front, but also the long-term environmental monitoring that's required. So a lot of technologies that are being developed to be able to better assess different species in the offshore environment. At Cove, we do a lot of work on developing the workforce. And I'm curious to know from James and Robin, what are some of the gaps that you're seeing in your businesses? Not, I guess in some respect, as you do work in the offshore wind sector, and what are the gaps that you're struggling with filling in your business? And also just more generally in the ocean sector, where are you struggling to hire talent, if you are? And any ideas on how we can help you, Cove, and our collaborators help you on making sure that you've got the talent in place to be able to bid into those major projects.
So look, clearly talent is critical to every business, and securing the right talent is absolutely key. As a business, we've just recently tipped over the 100-person mark in the company, and we'll look to recruit another 50 people before the end of this year. So hiring is an absolutely key topic for us in our business. What we're finding, though, is really quite interesting, and it comes back to your earlier point, Melanie, which is around innovation and I guess how the workplace is changing. So a lot of the roles that we're hiring are what we call either USV pilots. So these are qualified mariners who manage the safety of the vessel while it's at sea. And the other role is around online surveyors. So they're the experts that are making sure that we're collecting really high quality data. Now, traditionally, the mariners and the surveyors would need to be offshore and needed to accept a life with really long periods of time away from home on vessels. But in our world, the technology's moved on. So we're now offering the opportunity for those mariners and those surveyors to work from home, connected to the vessel via the internet and a satellite connection. And I think what we're finding is because of that, we're seeing a really, really strong pool of talent that's looking to, I guess, step away from that offshore life and be able to perhaps have a more normal work-life balance, whilst also still being a mariner, being a surveyor. So we're actually finding the opposite, that the innovation is leading us to a place which is really positive on the recruitment.
Anyone else want to jump in on that, on their thoughts on where there's gaps in the talent pool?
There's, he James may be correct. That's a trend that's following many different professions that are based around electronically transferable data and things like that. In my business, we're still the guys and the ladies that are on site operating the vessels, which James would be acquiring his information from. What we see lately, when I say lately, I'm going to say I work with some people here at Dominion Diving that have worked here for almost as long as I've been alive. Some of these people are, ready for retirement and things like that. So you get a pretty good snapshot of what's going on, what the way things were, the way things are, and the way things are going to be. To the best that you can determine. And there, as far as the proficiency of mariners, the way people are trained, there seems to be possibly a trend in physical awareness of the ocean and intuition and things like that. Not that those are reliable things to navigate by, but there was a syndrome that was discovered whenever it was, and I believe it was in the airline industry, but it's also present in the marine industry. It's called information inattention, and I don't know if it's a term or a medically validated term, but there's a heavy reliance on electronic assistance for navigation equipment, things like that. And the more and more reliance there is on it, the less attention is paid to what's outside the window when you look through it, if you understand what I mean by that. Information inattention is the result of being bombarded. It's a natural reaction of being bombarded with an extreme amount of data that's coming at you, and you may not be able to identify a problem that's very obvious and it's right in front of you. So I don't know how to rectify this or remedy it, but that's something that we've noticed, and some of our older captains have noticed with the newer trained personnel. I mean, good guys, good ladies, don't get me wrong on that. But there's a trend there that's definitely there's an element that's being lost in the new technology and information that we have at our disposal when these people are navigating and decision making. So it's a problem. It's an issue it's a trend, I should say, that's gonna create problems and is creating some problems. But other than that, this is somewhat of a natural progression as technology changes. How we react to the technology, we identify that, and then you address that, and you continue to develop the human reaction to it, and develop the technology to counteract each other and arrive at an optimum place where everything's perfect.
Yeah, well, we'd all like to get to a spot where everything's perfect. But I think it's an interesting concept that you talk about, because we get very focused on new technology and how we use new technology, and getting people who are looking at big data and using different techniques to internalize that data. But what you're talking is the real human element, and how are people being able to adapt when they're confronted with all this technology, all this information, and do they lose sight of their intuition? So I think that's pretty interesting not to lose sight of, and probably a conversation that can happen over many hours. So with that being said, I'd like to thank everyone for all of you for being part of this conversation. I'm personally quite excited about where the offshore wind sector is going. As I mentioned, I probably started working or being involved in offshore wind over 15, almost 20 years ago on the West Coast, and am very excited to see the level of growth that's happening all over the world in the sector, and really pleased to have yourselves as global leaders who are championing efforts in the offshore wind market being part of our conversation today. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today, looking at the future opportunities in offshore wind. If you'd like to know more about Cove, please check us out on all the social media channels, and you can also visit our website, coveocean.com. I look forward to our next Ocean Connector, which will focus on our interns that have been hard at work over the last couple of months and working with a multitude of different companies. So stay tuned for that in August. Thank you for watching.